You know that excruciating moment when someone tells such a blatant lie they might as well have "guilty" tattooed on their forehead? Well, Rachel Reeves just had precisely that moment in Parliament. And what's more, she didn't merely leave Parliament today, she practically sprinted out, stumbling over her own broken pledges, leaving a trail of scorched economic credibility in her wake. The reason? Helen Whately. Oh yes, Whately didn't just challenge Reeves, she sliced through Labour's winter fuel U-turn like a chainsaw through damp cardboard, leaving Reeves utterly flummoxed, like a deer caught in the headlights. This wasn't some gentle political nudge, it was a comprehensive demolition job that turned Reeves into the laughingstock of Westminster. Even Keir Starmer was left gazing blankly into space, pondering how his party's supposed economic whiz had just been publicly shredded like yesterday's tax returns. Brace yourselves, because this is the tale of how Rachel Reeves, the self-proclaimed guardian of the UK economy, was exposed as the architect of her own downfall, and how her boss, Keir Starmer, stood by silently, watching the ship go down. It all began with a decision so monumentally misguided, so politically tone-deaf, that you almost have to admire the sheer audacity it took to announce it with a straight face. Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor who claimed she'd rescued the economy and shielded the vulnerable, proudly unveiled plans to slash winter fuel payments for millions of UK pensioners. Yes, you heard correctly. Amidst a crippling cost of living crisis, with inflation devouring pensions like termites in an antique sofa, Reeves determined the most effective way to balance the books was to leave the elderly out in the cold. Literally. The backlash was immediate and furious. Pensioners, already meticulously budgeting just to keep their radiators running, erupted in outrage. Backbench MPs murmured about rebellion. Newspapers screamed betrayal. And the public, oh, they instantly smelt a rat. But what did Reeves do when the heat in the kitchen became unbearable? Did she admit her error? Did she apologize for jeopardizing the welfare of millions? Not a chance. Like a magician pulling a rabbit from a hat full of calamitous decisions, she announced a sudden U-turn. Winter fuel payments for 9 million pensioners would be reinstated, she declared, as if this transformed her into a hero rather than an arsonist arriving with a minuscule bucket of water. And to compound matters, she had the sheer gall, the unadulterated political cheek, to assert that this U-turn was a testament to Labour's robust economic management. Honestly, you couldn't invent this stuff. It's akin to a burglar breaking into your home, stealing your television, then turning up the next day to return it, expecting your gratitude for their kindness. And just when Reeves imagined she could spin this catastrophe into a triumph, Helen Whately took to the stage. Whately didn't merely critique Reeves, she utterly dismantled Labour's entire economic narrative on live television. It was like observing a lion casually dismembering its prey while the rest of the jungle looked on in stunned silence. With surgical precision, Whately welcomed the U-turn, as any respectable politician would, but immediately lacerated the fantasy that Labour's economic plans had any grounding in competence or genuine concern for the British populace. Who was Reeves attempting to deceive? Certainly not Parliament, and most certainly not the millions of pensioners who had already experienced the chilling impact of her initial policy. The answer, according to Whately, was no one. Labour's assertion of having a firm grip on the economy was, as she put it, for the birds, polite Westminster code for utter nonsense. But Whately wasn't finished. She meticulously itemized, point by painful point, the harsh, undeniable facts that Reeves and Starmer presumably hoped the public would overlook: inflation soaring to 2.8%, growth forecasts drastically cut, unemployment on the rise at 4.5%, government borrowing ballooning to £148 billion, a staggering £17 billion more than the last fiscal year. In essence, the economy Reeves claimed to have under control was slipping through Labour's fingers like sand in a shattered hourglass. It was a performance so brutal, so utterly merciless, that some MPs in the back row visibly winced. Reeves sat frozen, like a student caught red-handed cheating on an exam, while Starmer fumbled with his notes, looking as if he'd rather be anywhere but there. But the figures were merely the beginning. Whately then unleashed her firepower on the human cost, the true tragedy underpinning Labour's blunder. She spoke of the 50,000 pensioners pushed into poverty by the winter fuel cuts, the thousands more who ended up in A&E last winter because they couldn't afford to heat their homes, the hundreds of thousands who endured freezing nights wrapped in blankets because their government decided to save a few quid at their expense. These weren't mere statistics, they were real lives, real families, real suffering. And Reeves, who had campaigned as the champion of the vulnerable, had played a leading role in their misery. The silence in Parliament after Whately's speech was deafening. And what did Starmer do during this public excoriation of his Shadow Chancellor? Nothing. Not a word of defense, not a single protest. Like a captain watching his vessel take on water, he simply stood there, helpless, as his economic credibility sank beneath the waves. Because the truth was undeniable, this wasn't merely Reeves's failure, this was Labour's failure, a failure of foresight, a failure of compassion, a failure of leadership. And now, thanks to Whately's masterclass in political dissection, the entire nation could see it. To make matters worse, even Labour backbenchers, normally loyal to the bitter end, began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Whately pointed out that some were already breaking ranks, speaking out against their own party's policy catastrophe. When your own troops start deserting the battlefield, you know the war is lost. Reeves may have hoped to escape this debacle with a clever soundbite. Instead, she fled Parliament like a gambler caught cheating at the card table, leaving behind nothing but shame, confusion, and the distinct scent of political defeat. And Starmer? He remained seated, trapped in silence. No witty riposte, no grand defense, just the dull realization that his party's pledges of economic competence had disintegrated before the nation's very eyes. Helen Whately's demolition had been absolute, and the damage was done. What transpired next in Parliament wasn't merely embarrassing, it was historic. You could almost feel the weight of the moment hanging in the air, like the hush after a terrible joke that elicits no laughter. Rachel Reeves, who not long ago had stood proudly at the dispatch box, pontificating about tough economic choices and fiscal responsibility, was now shrinking in her seat while Helen Whately shredded her reputation. And it wasn't solely Whately inflicting the damage, the entire narrative Labour had meticulously constructed over the past year was collapsing like a poorly erected tent in a gale. You see, Labour's entire premise was straightforward: we are the serious ones. We'll fix the economy. Trust us, not those Tories. But after this winter fuel payment debacle, that fairy tale morphed into a political horror show. Small wonder Keir Starmer remained silent. What on earth could he possibly say to defend this level of incompetence? We intended to make pensioners suffer, but we've had a change of heart now. It's preposterous. Even his own backbenchers looked as if they'd swallowed a bad oyster. And Whately wasn't finished, oh no. Like a detective meticulously listing evidence in a courtroom drama, she calmly dissected the economic crime scene Labour had left behind. Inflation was creeping up again. Economic growth was headed in the wrong direction. Borrowing had ballooned far beyond what Reeves had promised in her grand pronouncements. And unemployment? Up, just as everyone had warned it would be when Labour started meddling without a coherent plan. It was akin to watching someone set their kitchen ablaze and then complain about the smoke alarm activating. Worse still, Whately reminded everyone in the chamber that these figures weren't merely abstract statistics for policy wonks to debate over a cup of tea. These were indicators that real people were going to suffer, people who had already paid the price for Reeves' initial disastrous decision. What made Whately's assault truly masterful was how she weaponized Labour's own words against them. Reeves had stood there months ago and asserted that the winter fuel cuts were indispensable. Without them, the nation's finances would spiral out of control, she'd claimed. But now that Labour had suddenly found the money to reverse those cuts, what did that imply about her original assertion? Either she was wrong then, or she's lying now. Pick your poison. Whately didn't need to spell it out, the implication was glaringly obvious to everyone watching: Reeves and Labour could not be trusted. Their economic plans were as flimsy as wet tissue paper, and their promises were worth even less. But the storm didn't abate within the chamber, oh no. This political earthquake sent shockwaves far beyond Westminster. Within minutes of Helen Whately's brutal takedown, social media exploded like a Guy Fawkes night fireworks display. X, formerly Twitter, Facebook, political forums, every corner of the internet erupted with memes, mockery, and outright disbelief. U-turn Queen Reeves trended nationwide, with one user quipping that Labour's economic strategy was seemingly being penned by a drunken GPS system, recalculating. Even normally loyal Labour sympathisers were scratching their heads, asking how their party, once so full of promise, had stumbled into such a ridiculous and humiliating predicament so early in government. And then the headlines began to roll in. The Times branded it Labour's first major policy disaster. The Telegraph gleefully declared, Reeves rolls back reality. Even The Guardian, usually inclined to give Labour the benefit of the doubt, ran a brutally candid editorial questioning how the party had managed to squander its economic credibility in record time. Commentators drew parallels between the winter fuel fiasco and the worst political flip-flops in history, from Nick Clegg's tuition fees catastrophe to Theresa May's infamous dementia tax U-turn. But this one, they argued, felt even more egregious because Reeves and Starmer had spent months sneering at Conservative chaos, promising that grown-ups were finally in charge. Now, they looked like bewildered children playing with matches. Meanwhile, backbench Labour MPs were in a full-blown panic. You could practically hear the phones ringing off the hook in constituency offices across the country, irate pensioners, confused voters, local councillors demanding to know what on earth was going on. Several MPs reportedly fired off furious messages to Starmer's team, warning that if this circus wasn't reined in swiftly, they'd lose their slender majorities at the next election. Some even threatened to rebel openly if another policy rethink emerged without proper consultation. The unity Starmer had boasted about during the campaign was cracking faster than glass in a hailstorm. The Tories, of course, couldn't believe their luck. Rishi Sunak, suddenly appearing by comparison like the calm, elder statesman, smirked knowingly in the Commons corridors as his MPs gleefully briefed the press. If this is Labour's competence, one senior Conservative whispered to a journalist, just wait until they try to renegotiate a trade deal or handle a proper crisis. We'll be back in Downing Street before they know what's hit them. It was brutal, and probably true. Labour had handed the Conservatives the perfect gift, an early disaster, proving they couldn't even manage their own flagship economic policy without tripping over their shoelaces. And let's not overlook the business world. The City, already apprehensive about Labour's economic plans, reacted with palpable alarm. Analysts at HSBC and Barclays slashed their UK growth forecasts within 24 hours. Investor confidence surveys dropped by 3 points. The pound wobbled slightly. On foreign exchange markets, not enough to trigger a full-blown panic, but certainly enough to convey a clear message: markets do not appreciate governments that execute U-turns without warning or clear explanation. Business leaders from the CBI and Chambers of Commerce issued carefully worded statements expressing concern about policy stability, diplomatic code for "what on earth are you playing at?" But the most devastating blow arrived from an unexpected quarter: the trade unions. Yes, the very organizations that had dedicated 2 years to pouring money, support, and energy into getting Labour elected were absolutely furious. Leaders from Unite and the GMB issued stern warnings that meddling with pensioners' welfare without proper consultation was entirely unacceptable. The TUC even hinted at potential friction at the next party conference. One senior union official reportedly told the BBC, "We didn't help put Labour in government to see working people and pensioners treated like this. They need to get their act together, or we'll make them." Ouch. When even your staunchest allies are threatening mutiny, you know the walls are closing in. As the dust began to settle, Rachel Reeves attempted desperately to control the narrative. She gave a clumsy, awkward interview on BBC Breakfast the following morning, insisting that the U-turn was a demonstration of Labour's flexibility and responsiveness to the public's needs. But nobody was buying it. The host systematically raised Whately's devastating points about the borrowing, the inflation, the unemployment, and Reeves stumbled through non-answers, dodging, weaving, changing the subject. The performance was so painful that one political commentator tweeted, "Reeves looks like she wishes the floor would open up and swallow her whole." And frankly, so do Labour's strategists. It was a disaster on live national television, a desperate attempt at damage control that only deepened the wounds. Meanwhile, Keir Starmer remained strangely silent. No press conference, no clarifying statement, no bold leadership moment to steady the ship. He simply vanished into the background, as if hoping the storm would pass if he lay low for long enough. But it didn't. Reporters hounded him outside Labour HQ, shouting questions about economic credibility and policy confusion. He waved them away, muttering something about focusing on the long term. But the damage was done, and voters noticed. Polling agencies scrambled to gauge the public mood. The initial results were horrifying for Labour, a 5-point drop in approval ratings overnight. Trust in Labour's economic competence, a central pillar of their campaign, plummeted to its lowest level since the election. Swing voters in key marginal constituencies told focus groups they were profoundly disappointed and worried about Labour's ability to govern. And just when Labour thought it couldn't get worse, it did. Treasury officials leaked details to the press showing that the winter fuel reversal would cost billions more than Labour had admitted, necessitating painful spending cuts elsewhere or even potential tax hikes. Front pages the next day screamed, Labour's £4 billion winter fiasco. It was political carnage, made worse by the fact that this government was barely 6 months old. Voters expected teething troubles, certainly, but not full-blown disasters before Christmas. The truth was now undeniable. Labour's meticulously constructed narrative of grown-up government had been shattered to pieces by its own hand. Whately's attack wasn't just a one-day wonder, it had ripped open a gaping wound that wouldn't heal quickly. Questions proliferated everywhere. What other policies were sitting on shaky ground? What other secret U-turns were being planned behind closed doors? Could Starmer even hold his government together if the rebellion from backbenchers and unions spread? The political jungle drums were beating louder by the hour. Journalists smelt blood. Tory MPs sharpened their knives. Voters shook their heads in disbelief. And somewhere in Downing Street, Rishi Sunak and his advisers must have cracked open the champagne. Not because they'd won anything, but because Labour had gifted them the easiest political victory imaginable, a self-inflicted, slow-motion collapse of credibility that would hang around their neck like a millstone for the remainder of their time in office. And Helen Whately? She sat back and watched it all unfold, smiling like the cat that got the cream. So, here we are, folks, standing amidst the smoking ruins of what was supposed to be Labour's grand moment of economic competence. Instead of bold leadership and sound decision-making, we've witnessed a circus of confusion, panic, and frantic U-turns that would make even the most seasoned politician wince. Helen Whately didn't just poke a hole in Labour's shiny economic balloon, she popped it with the force of a political sledgehammer and left the pieces scattered across Westminster for all to see. Rachel Reeves? Her credibility is hanging by a thread. Keir Starmer? Nowhere to be seen when leadership was most needed. Labour backbenchers? Grumbling, plotting, and warning that this winter fuel disaster is merely the beginning unless something changes fast. The unions? Furious. The voters? Doubting. The media? Having an absolute field day. And the Tories? Oh, they're relishing every minute of this spectacular Labour own goal, filing this little fiasco away for the next general election leaflet. Labour can't even manage one policy without falling to pieces. But what about you, the public, watching this mess unfold in real time? What do you think? Is this just a rookie mistake from a new government finding its feet, or is this the first sign that Labour isn't ready to handle the pressures of real power after all? Can Reeves and Starmer claw back their battered credibility, or has the mask finally slipped for good? Let us know in the comments below, because this story is far from over. Thank you.